Hey, John here. I got a request to do a very unique shadow box, so I thought I'd make a video of it. This one's kind of difficult. On a level of 1 to 10, I would say it's about an 8. I think the most difficult part is the sanding. You've got a lot of tight places that you've got to be creative to be able to sand it with. But I took this on just like I did the Texas shadow box, except this time I went a lot thinner, and the entire shadow box is no more than 2 inches wide. So it's going to look really good on a wall. So let's get cutting and I'll show you how I pulled this off. The first thing I did was print off a picture of what Dan wanted me to create. I wanted to see if it was truly a perfect square, which would make enlarging it pretty easy. And I decided how big I wanted to make it to ensure there was enough space inside to allow the display of shadows. Remember, I'm making a shadow box, not just the logo here. Instead of using the raster program like I always do to enlarge it, I pulled the picture into Photoshop and used my vinyl cutter to cut out the shape. So I'm kind of cheating this time. Then I cut the white backing with a 3/8 perimeter. This would be my wood guide. Looking at the black area, there, I knew I would have plenty of room for shadows. My next step was to see the best way to conserve wood. For this shadow box, I am using mahogany, and it was purchased online from the woodworker's source. Trust me when I tell you that their 100% satisfaction guarantee is upheld. You can see their link in the description below. Figuring out the best possible fit for each board, then I make my mark and take it to the miter saw. Remember, for each mark, you are going to cut 2 pieces of exact length. This is how we will create the height for each shape. Take your wood glue, lay down a coat, and spread it out thin. Then take your clamps and press your boards together really tight. This is basically the same process that I used during the making of the Texas shadow box, so not much has changed. Notice that I did not bother to cut off my live end of the board. Since we will be cutting these to the exact shape inside the edges, there will be no need to waste time on the edges. Once your piece is dry, you can take it back to your shape and trace out your perimeter. I first take some Scotch tape and tape it down so it does not move while I'm tracing it. I'm a bit clumsy and I doubt I can pull it off without tripping over something and making it move. Once in place, take a Sharpie and just trace the lines. After the outside is traced, I go back with a scrap piece and use it as a guide for the width. Continue around your line until the shape is complete. For all the straightaways, I use a miter saw to ensure I have a really flat and flush face. I often say that in each project I like to try something new. Well, with the Texas shadow box, I only cut the inside of the shape, and once I had the faceplate glued on, I cut the outside together with the edge. That made sanding a lot easier. This time will be different. Since the entire perimeter of the shadow box will be so thin, I do not want to change the shape of it by creating a lip for the plexiglass on the inside to sit on. Instead, my plexiglass will sit in a groove so my faceplate can be flush with the interior shape of the box as well. And then later, I will just route the outer portion of the faceplate to match the perimeter. But anyway, this is the part everyone loves, cutting wood. It's fun and it's why we're all here, right? We like to cut wood. Well, all interior straightaways here are going to be used with the fence. Everything else, we'll just eyeball it. If you're wondering why I turned this piece over to continue the cut, look to the left and you'll see that I did not have enough throat clearance for this piece because my little bandsaw is only 10 inches. So basically, we just keep repeating that process until all the pieces are cut out. Once all your pieces are cut, then you just glue them together. If you look closely, you will see that I have added some temporary support to the joints on the frame. This is just until I am finished sanding and I am ready to put the faceplate on. I just took some small scrap pieces and staple gunned them down, and I will pull them out later. I know the glue is strong enough to hold a tight bond, but it is better to be safe than sorry when putting so much pressure on the frame while you're sanding in awkward positions. And remember, Only sand the interior of the box right now. Don't waste any time sanding the exterior. Next, you need to take your frame and trace out the back plate. Here you will see that I am using a 1/4 inch maple plywood. This stuff is really pretty, but it chips. So in the end, I used tempered hardboard instead. It's not filmed, but the process is the same, so no need to watch it twice. I really like how the tempered hardboard looks, and the edges do not chip when cutting. And as you can see, I am making 2 versions of this box, one in oak as well. So I don't know if I will ever get around to finishing it though. Okay, before you do this next step, you need to know what size router bit you will be using to create a groove for your back plate. Mine will end up being a 3/8. When you decide on one, measure from the bearing to the blade and then add that distance to the outer perimeter you just traced. That will be your cut line later. Now that the interior of the box is sanded, take it to your foam board. Here I use 2 pieces glued together to give me a 1/2 inch. I buy my foam board at Everything's $1. So take your frame and lay it on the foam board and just trace out the interior. You should have a smooth sanded interior at this point. Now take an X-Acto knife, break off a new blade and cut out your shape. Normally I would tell you to shave off 1/8 of an inch when cutting it, but since we will be making so many interior cuts, this will shrink the size. Go ahead and cut exactly on the line while you're cutting this out. Once cut, check your fit. If all is well, repeat for the bottom portion. Use the leftover piece from what we cut earlier. After the bottom piece is cut, we will simply duct tape it to the top. Taping them together gives this smooth transition. This is for the felt, so no deviation shows through. It's not to keep the pieces together. You can tape both sides, but really only the top is needed. Before you route, take a scrap piece of the back plate and set your bit to take off half. This will reduce any chipping by trying to take off too much at one time. And besides, my blade is not that wide. Remember to go in the correct direction when routing. And do not, I repeat, do not route the bottom of your frame before you trace out your back plate. If you do, you will not be able to use the smooth edge of the interior that's in contact with the back plate before routing. It makes your trace really bad if you do. After your first pass, simply raise the bit to the top of the scrap piece and repeat the process. Okay, another warning here. Discount double check that you're routing the back side of the box, not the top. And do not do both while you are at this step. For the same reasons of the back plate, you will need contact with the faceplate to be smooth without deviation, and you will not get that if you route early. Once complete, you should have a nice lip around the back side of your box. Now we are going to start making the faceplate. This is where I made a big change from the way I made the Texas shadow box. I am going to route a lip on the front side of the frame just like I did on the back side for the back plate. This time the plexiglass will sit on the lip, and doing it this way will allow me to cut the faceplate flush with the interior as well as the exterior of the box, keeping it thin all the way around. So I took my pieces and ripped them into very thin pieces about 3/16 width, so I could get 3 pieces out of each board. I then stagger the wood so it fits over each piece of the frame. This helps me conserve the wood as well. Then I make my marks and number them so my pieces stay aligned and in order when gluing them together. I ripped these boards on the bandsaw, but for you it will be a lot easier to buy thin planks pre-cut, so I won't bore you with making you watch me rip these. But this part is pretty easy. Let's just glue them together, clamp them tight, and then allow them time to dry. After they have had enough time to dry, take your frame and lay it upside down on the faceplate. Here I clamp it down to ensure it does not move while I trace it. Then simply just take a pencil, trace out the interior of the frame directly onto the faceplate. While it is still clamped down, trace out the exterior of the frame at the same time. Now look closely at my exterior trace. It is about a 1/4 inch away from the frame. This will be my rough cut line. You will understand why we did this later. Go back to your backplate and cut it to a manageable size. Do this quick because this cut is not important. Then with a jigsaw or bandsaw if you have one, cut the exterior line of your backplate. Although I do not end up using the maple plywood in the final product, the process for drawing out and cutting the backplate with the tempered hardboard is exactly the same. Okay, everyone loves it when I make mistakes because it proves I'm not a pro. And I don't edit them out. But here, at my first attempt to make a very thin faceplate, it backfired. While cutting this out with the jigsaw, I snapped it in half. Now I'm not making this up, but the battery on the camera actually died while I was cutting, and I didn't know it, which turned out to be a blessing in disguise because I swore really loud and pitched a fit by punching the piece, breaking it into a few extra. I decided to give the faceplate another day and I would cut and glue it tomorrow. So I went back to my display board and drew out the logo onto the foam board. I then simply traced over the pencil with a Sharpie to get a good look at how it would turn out. Once all my lines were drawn, I took it over to the workbench and cut out all the individual pieces. Earlier, when I said that we will not need to subtract the 1/8 of an inch due to the multiple cuts, you will now see how cutting this will shrink the display board. But don't worry, the felt will give it its volume back. So for all you watching, you will see that I clearly label all the pieces with the appropriate color and even take the time to number them as well. You probably don't need to do this, but it would be smart to at least place an X on each one so you don't make the mistake and end up felting the wrong side of the piece. Now putting on the felt is the same as it is in all my boxes, but when you have a lot of curvy shapes, it is good to put a lot of relief cuts into the felt to help it better conform to the curves. Put a small bead of glue down all the way around the very edge of the perimeter of each shape, and then take some duct tape and use it to help pull the felt up and over so you get a tight fit and maintain direct contact with the glue while it dries. Now we are just going to repeat this same process for each shape in each of its different colors until the display board is complete. I don't want to skip this part because the ends can get pretty tricky when they come to a point like they do with these shapes. But if you have a clothespin or any other small clamp, just put some glue on the end of the point and pinch together. You can simply use scissors to trim it up after it's dry and make it look good. Check your pieces as you go and continue until all the pieces are complete. So the next morning I recut my faceplate, this time much thicker, and I went through the process of outlining my frame, inside and outside line cuts. I then repeated my earlier steps of gluing each piece of the faceplate together, so nothing has changed in these steps. I'm just repeating them. So while my faceplate is drying, I took the time to recut the backplate with the tempered hardwood. This stuff looks great and it does not chip. Now that it's cut, I put it in place and decide to glue in my display board. Place the backplate back into the frame and just lay down a healthy coat of wood glue, then place in your display board pieces. Having your frame in place will ensure a perfect location of your display board when gluing it down. Then once all your pieces are in place, take some heavy weight and put it directly on top of them to ensure they maintain contact with the backplate. While the display board is drying, I jump back to the faceplate and cut it out. I take a drill bit first and drill out each pivot point. Make sure that your drill bit you use is at least the width of your jigsaw blade so you can pivot easily, and then simply cut it out. At this point, I have only cut out the interior of the faceplate. This is so while sanding the interior, I am not as worried about snapping it in half like I did last time, because it's pretty thin. Take a detailed sander and sand the edge really smooth and give the face a nice round lip. Go back to your box and check your fit. Make sure everything is perfectly aligned. If it is a little off, just keep sanding it until it aligns perfectly. Before I stained, I actually took some wood grain filler and went around the perimeter of the faceplate and filled it in. I really don't think with mahogany you need this. I know it's a granule wood, but this step was really not needed, so I would skip it if I were you. Now that you have your faceplate cut, you can go back to your frame and route the lip for your plexiglass. Using the same process that you did for the backplate, cut out your lip. Before I moved on, I cut off a scrap piece from the corner of my sheet of plexiglass, and I went all the way around the box in the lip to ensure no part of the plexiglass was higher than the top of the frame. If it is, you will have big problems when gluing it on, as well as a visible gap on the side of the box, so do not skip this step. The round router guide does not give you a lot of space in the tip of the missile, so I took my freehand router and just cut out some to make my lip bigger and give me more room for the plexiglass to sit on. Now this method will give you a perfect fit for your plexiglass. Lay it over the top of your frame. Discount double check that it's the top of your frame and that your box is not upside down. And then take a Sharpie and draw a line using the lip of your frame as your guide. This will give you a perfect measurement all the way around your box. Grab your jigsaw and simply cut out your lines. Here I take it to the bandsaw to save myself some time. After your cut is made, go back and check it. It should be perfect, as this is pretty hard to screw up with the lines being so precise. Once in place, grab your frame and check the fit. Check everything one more time. Remember, at no point during this process should you remove the clear plastic protection on either side of the plexiglass. Now stain your faceplate. Remember, you don't need to waste stain on the whole thing. Just stain it around the perimeter. Once dry, flip your faceplate over and cut out the exterior of your faceplate. Remember, this is not a perfect cut. When we drew it, it was just a rough cut line that you drew along the perimeter, so it shouldn't be that precise. Grab your orbital sander and smooth away any irregularities that would prevent your faceplate from laying flush onto the frame. Take a damp washcloth and wipe down the back side of your faceplate to ensure you have removed all or any sawdust residue that occurred during sanding. This will also help create a better seal when gluing. Flip your faceplate over and lay it on top of your box. We are now going to attach it. Now, this is where I recommend knocking on your neighbor's door and borrowing all his clamps as well. For this next step, I can't stress enough that you can't have too many clamps. Before you put down a bead of glue, pull up an inch perimeter of the protective plastic that is on the plexiglass. Normally on a square box you can just cut it flush, but for this you don't want to be in a position where you're trying to pick out small pieces that are wedged into the groove and possibly scratch your plexiglass in the process. So just pull up an inch perimeter all the way around your plexiglass. I use a little scotch tape to hold back what I have pulled up. This is more so it does not accidentally touch any glue when I am putting it in position. I know glue comes off glass easy, but I have not run into the problem of glue on plexiglass yet, and I don't want to. Then put a small bead of glue around your lip. From there, smooth it out with your finger. Important, swipe from the inside out so you don't drag any into the plexiglass lip. When you're done, if you have accidentally managed to get some into the lip, clean it out with a paper towel and screwdriver to keep it from pressing out into viewable space when you put your faceplate on. Now you're ready to place your plexiglass in position and attach your faceplate. Take your time and align your faceplate to your frame. Then start applying your clamps. I personally start in 4 corners to ensure that my faceplate stays aligned and does not move. Then I randomly stagger and fill in the spaces all the way around. Keep looking under the faceplate to make sure you have a good seal all the way around the box and use clamps directly where needed the most.
If you have any gaps, they will be visible on the side when we trim the faceplate, so pay attention to the underside during this step. When you're done clamping, the Insanity should look like this. While that is drying, you can go set up your router now for the final steps of finishing the faceplate. Next, we need to change out your router bit to a trimming bit. If you don't have one, these are the same type of bits that are used on countertops to make the edges flush. When your faceplate is good and dry, you can now trim away the excess. The excess was the rough cut lip that we left when cutting the faceplate out. Unlike the Texas shadow box where we cut both the outer frame and the faceplate together at the same time, I thought in my head this would work just as well. After all, I am making this up as I go along.
Hey, I clean as I go, and I threw this in here just to make my mom proud.
So now that your outer edge has been trimmed, we can begin sanding the perimeter of the box before we stain. This should be the first time that you have sanded the outer edge of the frame, so go ahead and take your time. So in the beginning of this project, I stated that sanding this box was a bit complicated and you have to get creative. Well, here's what I did. On one section, I cut a small piece of wood and stuck some sticky sandpaper on it. This is the sandpaper that goes on the detail sander. I have to tell you that when I was cutting the sticky paper to size, I actually almost cut off my finger with a pair of scissors. Yeah, it's complicated. Here I thought I was really creative. For the round inside spots, I took a dowel and I taped some sandpaper to it. Then I stuck it in my cordless drill and just ran the drill on it. I patted myself on the back for this one and got blood on my shirt because I was still bleeding from the previous cut. Once you're done sanding, you can stain it. I stained the entire box again because I ended up resanding the faceplate. Just like always, I used paper towels to apply it and then I set it out in the sun to dry. Your last step in all this is to pull your plastic protection from your box and you're done. Now it's time to add the shadows. For this box, I did not apply any of the shadows. Dan did his own, and he did a fantastic job. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.